March 9, 1993. A van leaves Broadmoor High Security Hospital in Berkshire. Two young women sit inside, twins, pale, small-framed, and for the first time in more than a decade, they are being moved out of a place where they'd been told they didn't belong. One of them lays her head on the other's shoulder and says, quietly, "At long last, we're out." Hours later, Jennifer Gibbons is dead. Her cause of death, acute myocarditis. Her sister June walks out of that same hospital months later, and, almost overnight, her silence lifts. She speaks. She begins to live. This is the story of two lives braided so tightly that one could not be imagined without the other, and of a death that still leaves questions. Welcome to Still Unanswered. I'm Amelia Cross. Reuben.
Amelia, thanks. It's hard to think of a case that sits more uneasily at the intersection of psychiatry, race, and the law. What we have here is not a tidy clinical vignette. It's a set of human lives shaped by trauma, misunderstanding, and institutional choices. I'm Dr. Reuben Malik, consultant psychiatrist. Today, I'll try to separate what we can reasonably know from the things people keep filling in with myth.
Reuben, let's start with the basics. June and Jennifer Gibbons, born in 1963 to parents from Barbados on a British military base in Aden. They grew up in Haverfordwest, a small Welsh town where they were among the only black children. Tell our listeners why that matters.
It matters a great deal. Social context shapes development. Being one of the only black families in a small, insular town in the 1960s and 70s exposed them to persistent racism, verbal abuse, exclusion, sometimes physical bullying. That isolation can push siblings closer, especially twins. When your world tells you you are different, you may turn inward and build a private world where you feel safe. That's not pathology on its own, it's adaptation.
And in the twins' case, that private world included a language that was described as rapid, bird-like, and largely incomprehensible to outsiders, and a pattern of mirrored movements, walking in step, turning heads together. They stopped speaking to other people around ages 3 or 4. What do clinicians call that pattern?
Historically, many clinicians use the term elective or selective mutism, which simply observes that someone can speak but chooses not to in certain social contexts. But with June and Jennifer, there's more. An intensely shared, mutually reinforcing relationship. In psychiatry, we sometimes talk about folie à deux, or shared psychotic disorder, where two people, often relatives, reinforce delusional beliefs in each other. In their case, the shared language and rituals operate like a private cognition system, a two-person world that can seem impermeable to everyone else.
But, Reuben, I want to push back on an easy diagnostic label. The twins were called psychotic or dangerous early on, labels that, in hindsight, look as much like institutional shorthand as careful clinical description. You've written about how psychiatric labels reflect the clinician's context and biases. How might race and the institution have shaped the way doctors and courts saw these girls?
We must be blunt. Diagnoses are not made in a vacuum. In the early 1980s, British psychiatry had limited cultural competence. Behaviour that could be read as social withdrawal in a white child might have been treated differently. There might have been more outreach, more family-based intervention. With June and Jennifer, the only visibly black children in a small town, their silence was often interpreted as more threatening or more other. Once the legal system and psychiatrists began to see them as dangerous, the available options narrowed, and that created a pathway toward longer, more secure detention.
Which is what happened. After a 6-week crime spree in 1981, arson, vandalism, theft, the girls were arrested. Police found sacks and sacks of writing, diaries, short stories, small novels. They were creative, prolific. But instead of a youth custodial sentence or psychotherapy, they were, in 1982, sent under the Mental Health Act to Broadmoor. Indefinite detention, very unusual for non-violent arson. Why Broadmoor?
Broadmoor was, and is, a place for patients considered a significant risk to others, often violent offenders. 2 teenage girls with property crimes belong somewhere else. Clinicians at the time described the twins as having severe mental disorder, at times using terms like schizophrenia or psychopathic personality. Those judgments were probably influenced by their intense enmeshment and by the content of their writings and behaviors. In a risk-averse system, especially where race and social marginalization are in play, the tendency is to err on the side of containment. That decision, sending them to a maximum security hospital, had profound consequences.
Containment that lasted 11-12 years. In Broadmoor, they were separated and reunited, heavily medicated, restrained by the institution, while the institution tried to reshape them. We have accounts of them biting, strangling, and harming each other when together. Violence born of tangled love, perhaps, but also catatonia and refusal to eat when separated. That ambivalence, do they need each other to survive, or are they destroying each other, features centrally in their diaries. I want to read a line often quoted. "I'm in enslavement to her. We have become fatal enemies in each other's eyes. Without my shadow would I die. Without my shadow would I gain life." Reuben, when you read that, what do you see?
I see dependency and antipathy at once, the hallmark of what clinicians call symbiotic or enmeshed relationships. It's not unusual for twins to have intense bonds, but when that bond prevents individual identity development, it can become pathological. "Without my shadow would I die" is both metaphor and literal fear. The fear of being alone can be so intense that someone will maintain a harmful attachment rather than face separation. That said, it's essential not to read the metaphor as instruction. People don't, in ordinary terms, will their own deaths because of a pact. We need to separate symbolic language from somatic causality.
We will return to that distinction, symbolic, later. During their Broadmoor years, there's an anecdote that haunts me. Visits from Jimmy Savile. June described him as a flashily dressed celebrity who jumped on their table and said, "I'll have you first and you second." That's chilling for more reasons than one. It underlines how they were trapped in a system that exposed them to predation while simultaneously claiming to protect them. Reuben, can you reflect on what those contradictory impulses, care and exposure, do to a patient's sense of safety?
They destroy it. Therapeutic institutions owe patients safety, predictable routines and boundaries. When staff and famous visitors blur those boundaries, mixing care with spectacle or worse, you erode trust. For June and Jennifer, who already had a fragile private world, this kind of environment probably heightened paranoia and confusion. It also reinforces the sense that the outside world is inhospitable and that the only place of true refuge is the twin relationship, even if that refuge is itself damaging.
Let's go back to their writing for a moment. They kept meticulous diaries, tiny script, long stories. Their fiction contains dark themes: celebrity, revenge, identity, sexuality. They published small pamphlets by mail order. Reuben, what does such prolific writing say about cognitive function in people who were described as psychotic?
It tells us that creative capacity, linguistic access, and complex thought are present. Psychosis doesn't necessarily mean a loss of all logical narrative. Many people with psychosis are creative. Think of musicians, writers, artists. But with the twins, their writing served multiple functions: a private language, a way to process trauma, and a means to exert control. The clinical narratives that reduce them to madness often miss the sophistication of that inner life.
And that inner life included a pact. Multiple sources, Marjorie Wallace among them, report the twins discussed that one of them would have to die so the other could live. Some of the writing suggests Jennifer agreed to be the one. We need to talk about that pact calmly. What are the possible readings of it?
There are at least three. 1. A symbolic pact, an intense belief that allows them to project hope and release onto an imagined future where one twin is free. 2. A psychosomatic pathway, where belief affects health via stress, immune function, and risk behaviors, potentially worsening an existing medical condition. 3. A literal act of self-harm, which, in Jennifer's case, there is no evidence for. The facts of Jennifer's death: acute myocarditis found on post-mortem, no drugs or poisons, fit with a medical explanation. But the timing invites interpretive overlays. We must tolerate ambiguity.
Ambiguity, yes. On March 9, during the transfer, June said Jennifer rested her head on her shoulder and then slumped, drowsy, sleeping with her eyes open. At Caswell Clinic, she was taken to hospital and died that evening. The post-mortem gave us myocarditis. Reuben, explain myocarditis in plain language and how quickly it can kill.
Myocarditis is inflammation of the heart muscle, usually caused by a viral infection. Common culprits include Coxsackie viruses, influenza, or even some autoimmune reactions. Symptoms can be subtle: fatigue, chest pain, palpitations, headache, sometimes fever. In some people it resolves, in others it progresses rapidly to heart failure or arrhythmia. Young, seemingly healthy people can die suddenly from myocarditis. It's tragic but not mystical.
So medically plausible. But the inquest in 1993 was criticised. The charity SANE complained that the jury was denied specialist cardiology evidence. The family wanted more witnesses from Broadmoor, but the coroner limited testimony. That lack of transparency fed speculation. Reuben, how do institutional constraints, like limiting witnesses, affect public trust after a death like this?
They erode it. When an inquest feels truncated, families and advocates fill gaps with suspicion. For people already inclined to believe in conspiracies or fated narratives, restricted testimony becomes proof of cover-up. That doesn't mean a cover-up occurred, but it does mean authorities lost an opportunity to provide a clearer explanation. In sensitive cases, those involving minority groups, state institutions, and sudden deaths, full, open inquiry matters for trust and healing.
We should underline another fact. In the weeks before the transfer, Jennifer had been unwell: weight loss, headaches, fatigue. Marjorie Wallace visited on February 28 and found Jennifer very thin, but talkative and optimistic about leaving Broadmoor. 2 weeks later, she was dead. It's easy to let the pact narrative crowd out the mundane medical truth, but the pact narrative persists because it reads like a story. 2 twins, 1 sacrifice, 1 survival. Human beings love tidy symbolism. Reuben, how do we keep the story humane without romanticizing tragedy?
We hold both the human need for meaning and the rigor of clinical evidence in tension. We can acknowledge how the twins made meaning out of their suffering through music, writing, and this pact, without asserting that meaning caused a physical event. We must resist the pull to exoticize or mystify. The ethics question remains: did we, as a society, fail them? Did institutions respond with care or containment? Those are the questions that matter morally, not whether a pact had metaphysical power.
Let's step back and consider the crimes themselves. Arson, theft, beginnings of a juvenile delinquent narrative. In many counties, 2 teenagers would receive a custodial or community sentence. June later said, "Juvenile delinquents get 2 years in prison. We got 12 years of hell because we didn't speak." Reuben, how do you see the proportionality of the response?
Disproportionate. Even if the twins' behavior met criteria for psychiatric hospitalization initially, the move to indefinite detention in a high-security facility was extreme. Part of this is the psychiatric system's historic inclination to pathologize deviance in those it finds hard to understand. Part is procedural. Once someone enters the forensic system, it's challenging to exit. The system conflates risk with cure and tends to keep people in protective custody longer than necessary. Add racial prejudice to that, and you get the sort of injustice their case suggests.
Which leads to hard ethical questions. They were medicated, antipsychotics, reportedly at high doses, which left them sluggish, with side effects like tardive dyskinesia. In an institution, the idea of consent is complicated. Can someone detained under the Mental Health Act truly consent to or refuse treatment? And how does long-term medication affect creativity and the inner life that made the twins unique?
Detained patients have rights, but effectively asserting them is difficult. The Mental Health Act allows treatment without consent under certain conditions, particularly when risk is considered high. That's because the clinical and legal frameworks prioritize safety. But safety achieved through heavy dosing and constraint can destroy autonomy and harm identity. For people whose primary voice was writing, sedative medications may have muted that creative outlet, even if they provided symptom relief. Ethically, we must ask whether the treatment balanced benefit and harm, and whether alternatives, like family therapy or community supports, were explored robustly.
Let's talk about June after Jennifer's death. June began to speak. She was released within a year or so, and, by the 2000s, living independently in West Wales. She gave limited interviews, described the Broadmoor years as 12 years of hell, and recounted moments, like the Savile visit, that illustrate how out of step the institution was with basic decency. Reuben, how do you interpret June's sudden re-emergence into speech?
From a clinical standpoint, if selective mutism or enmeshment was maintained by the twin bond, the removal of that bond by death or separation can release the surviving twin to develop a separate identity. It's not miraculous, it's the brain and psyche adjusting to a shocking change, and, in June's case, perhaps a longed-for freedom. But it also carries deep loss. Post-release speech does not erase trauma. It simply signals a shift in relational dynamics.
June has expressed guilt and regret over the crimes. She's also insisted the sisters were creative and misunderstood. Media adaptations, Marjorie Wallace's book, the 1986 BBC film, stage pieces, and more recent podcasts have kept the story in public imagination. Some adaptations emphasize mystery and the pact, others focus on institutional failure. Reuben, are we at risk of reducing these women to a narrative trope, the eerie silent twins, and losing the personhood behind the trope?
Absolutely. Sensationalized accounts strip agency and nuance. June and Jennifer were not curiosities. They were people shaped by family, culture, harm, and creativity. They deserved tailored care and dignity. When the media fetishizes the pact or the strange behaviors without context, it reinforces the very dehumanization that contributed to their suffering.
We've spoken a lot about psychiatry and institutions. Let's address competing theories about Jennifer's death head-on. Theory 1, strictly medical, a viral myocarditis that happened to manifest fatally during transfer. Theory 2, psychosomatic, that deep belief and deprivation could have weakened her, making a viral illness more lethal. Theory 3, institutional failure, that Broadmoor didn't or couldn't adequately care for her physical health. Which of these is most plausible, Reuben?
All three can coexist. My money, clinically, is on a primary medical event. Myocarditis can kill young people rapidly and often unpredictably. Psychosocial stresses can lower immune resilience, increasing susceptibility. And institutional care can fail to detect subtle medical decline, or the focus on psychiatric stabilization can overshadow thorough medical assessment. So it's not about choosing one theory, it's about acknowledging a probable medical cause set against a background of chronic stress and imperfect care.
Which leaves us with more questions than neat answers. Did Jennifer die because of a virus, or because the institutions that held them failed to protect her, or because a pact became a self-fulfilling prophecy? Maybe all of the above. Reuben, for clinicians listening, what lessons should we take from this case?
First, don't pathologize cultural difference. Second, prioritize proportionate responses. Forensic facilities are not the default for adolescent deviance or social withdrawal. Third, treat medical and psychiatric needs together. Integrated care matters. Fourth, listen to family and community voices. They often see what institutions miss. Finally, be humble. Complex cases resist tidy answers, and humility prevents harm.
For policymakers and the public, what changes might have altered the outcome for these girls?
Early, family-based interventions, culturally competent outreach in schools, community mental health supports, and alternatives to secure detention, these would have helped. Courts and clinicians need better heuristics for risking over-medicalizing socially derived problems. And oversight, transparent, independent review when state institutions detain citizens could build accountability that might have addressed the post-mortem criticisms.
I want to bring us back to a human image before we move toward closing. June and Jennifer, as children, spoke to each other, made up stories, and mirrored one another until a private language cocooned them. They were creative, troubled, brilliant, and afraid. Their diaries, 2 sacks discovered in their room, are a reminder that silence is not absence. Reuben, One last clinical question before we wrap. For people who share such an intense enmeshment, what therapeutic approaches can help without destroying the relationship they depend on?
Therapies that honor attachment and promote individuation are key. Family therapy, systemic psychotherapy, carefully scaffolded separations, and identity work. The goal isn't to sever ties, but to expand the self, helping each twin find a voice outside the dyad. In institutional contexts, that requires patience, continuity of care, and cultural sensitivity. Forced, abrupt separations, like those that occurred early in the twins' history, can backfire, worsening outcomes.
Reuben, thank you. As I think about the twins' final hours, I keep coming back to the image of Jennifer resting her head on June's shoulder and saying, "At long last, we're out." It reads like relief, like hope, and within hours we witness a medical tragedy. The truth is simultaneously ordinary and terrible. A viral illness, a stressed body, a system that had kept them in a place that, by every account, stunted and harmed them. We can hold both the cold medical facts and the human poetry of that last line. They do not cancel each other out.
That's the honesty these cases require. We should resist the lure of tidy narratives, sacrifice, miracle, or malfeasance, and instead sit with complexity. Allow that condolence and critique can coexist. We mourn a young life lost, and we critique systems that failed to protect it. We can hold both the cold medical facts and the human poetry of that last line. They do not cancel each other out.
Before we close, a few brief readings from the twins' words to linger on. Without my shadow would I die. Without my shadow would I gain life. And another. We have become fatal enemies in each other's eyes. Those lines are not sensational hooks. They are human expressions of terror and dependence. They demand care and reflection, not spectacle. Reuben, any final words for our listeners?
Listen with curiosity and humility. When you hear strange behavior, withdrawal, silence, intense sibling bonds, ask not what is wrong with them, but what happened to them. Systems of care should be rooted in that question. And if you work in institutions, remember, transparency, cultural competence, and proportionality save lives.
Thank you, Reuben. And thank you to our listeners for joining us for this episode of Still Unanswered. The story of June and Jennifer resists easy closure. It asks us to examine how we treat difference, how we manage risk, and how we respond to people whose voices have been turned inward. If you want to read more, our episode notes include sources: Marjorie Wallace's book, archive reporting from The Independent and the BBC, and the coroner's coverage from 1993. Finally, a request. If you have thoughts or responses to this episode, or if this story brings up memories or concerns, reach out. We want to hear how these stories land. For now, a final, quiet thought. Sometimes silence is protection, sometimes it's a prison, and sometimes it is both. We owe those who lived in that silence the patience to listen carefully. This is Amelia Cross. Good night.